Thanks very much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here with you today. Let me see if my Face ID is working. Yes. I'd like to first of all thank Arnie for the welcome to country and to give my acknowledgement to this is Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and to give our collective respects to First Nations elders past, present and emerging, not least you, Auntie, and all those First Nations peoples who are present with us today. And indeed, Auntie, as we were coming here in the cab, we gave directions. We were going to the dome, and Cabby said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's the big spaceship." And I think it is lovely to be here in this gorgeous room. And I think there's a nice sort of reflection on the Commonwealth that we're doing a transparency forum without Wi-Fi, surrounded by a moat. It really does feel like we're reflecting on the Commonwealth Parliament in the built environment that we have here. I want to acknowledge all the distinguished guests in the room, and I won't name you all, and also thank the Australia Institute and all of the sponsors for, I think, at a critical time as we're literally beginning election season and thinking about what the political debate should be in not only this election, but in what will probably be a very interesting parliament that follows it. What should be the role for transparency, and what should the Commonwealth Parliament be delivering on transparency? Because right now we find ourselves in a world, particularly at a Commonwealth level, where there is secrecy for the powerful, but it seems like endless raids on the privacy of individuals across the country. And that balance has never been more starkly out of kilter than we've seen, as each of us are seeing our private details raided and commercialised and sold without our consent or with our pretend consent. And meanwhile, the most powerful level of government in the country, some of the most powerful institutions, whether it's Defence, or Treasury or the Commonwealth itself, seem to be protected with levels of privacy and secrecy that really have no long history in our Commonwealth and should have no place in a liberal democracy. Because while the government seems to be hiding ever more information, and even integrity bodies are worryingly opaque, we've got regular citizens having their every moment tracked online. We have our online data being sold on global marketplaces on average 400 times a day for each of us. We have little, if any, protection for ourselves, but this wall of protection around politicians, ministers, secretaries, and powerful institutions. And that addiction to secrecy, at the same time as our privacy is being raided, is really eroding trust in government. It's eroding trust in institutions. And with the current government actually proposing a new all-purpose secrecy law, just in case we hadn't been caught by the 350 that they've already got on the statute books, I don't think there could be a more important time to come together and have this critical discussion. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for, I hope will be, and I'm sure will be, some of the prompts, hopefully some of the debate starters, the discussion points that should feed into the election, but even more importantly to that, feed into the parliament that follows. This presentation is about the NACC, the watchdog that was designed not to bark. So why don't we go back to 3 years ago, and if you remember, we had a federal election, we had an opposition and a bunch of crossbenchers who were saying there's a problem with transparency, there's a problem with secrecy. And it turns out there was incredible problems. We had secret ministries being handed out, if you remember that. I remember that. We had scandal after scandal. We had robo-debt. We had major corruption issues and procurement issues in defence. And there was a promise that we would get adult government. Do you remember that? Adult government, we'd have a change in tone, we'd legislate finally for a National Anti-Corruption Commission, we would finally get transparency. I remember the current Attorney General swearing affidavits in challenges to the FOI system, complaining about the backlog and the lack of funding and waiting years and years and years to get information out of the FOI system. And then when he became Attorney General, he actually continued to fund the case to knock off the FOI application that he put an affidavit in support of. You know, remarkable. But then we got the NACC. And the legislation was drafted by the current government, popped into Parliament, and then suddenly it became clear that, that there's a collective interest, actually, between the Labor Party and the Coalition. There's a collective interest they had to ensure that the NACC didn't bark, to ensure that whatever the rhetoric in opposition, the reality in government was fundamentally different. And I had come from New South Wales, right? New South Wales is not known for its corruption-free politics. This will surprise you. It's kind of notorious for it in many ways. And part of the response in New South Wales has been the creation of an incredibly powerful, deeply embarrassing anti-corruption commission in the form of ICAC. And one of the most powerful things that ICAC has done is hold public hearings. I've saw multiple occasions when I was down in Macquarie Street with the political class incredibly angry about ICAC having public hearings, talking about embarrassment, talking about scandal, deeply concerned that time after time ICAC would have a public hearing, identify a scandal, identify deeply improper conduct, but then because our anti-corruption laws are literally based on 17th century English torts, be unable to put the evidence together to have an actual prosecution of corruption. And in a way that only the political class can do, instead of realising we have broken anti-corruption laws based on 17th century English torts that aren't designed to hold the powerful to account, they said, oh, there's a problem with ICAC. There's a problem with ICAC because they're identifying scandal and wrongdoing, but they're not putting anyone in jail. Therefore, the answer is they wanted to shut down ICAC and kill the public hearings for ICAC. You couldn't think of a worse lesson to draw from what we saw time after time in ICAC. But it appears that that lesson was learnt by the Commonwealth. Because after introducing the NACC legislation, there was a deal done. And I'm sure you all remember it, a deal done between the Attorney General and the opposition leader to put in place this incredibly high threshold for public hearings. There needed to be exceptional circumstances before a hearing would be held in public. And it was almost as though, indeed one would say, it was very clear that the Commonwealth had been watching what happened in New South Wales and realised, in fact, the most powerful thing that the New South Wales ICAC had was public hearings. And to quote from the current ICAC Commissioner, he said this, New South Wales ICAC Commissioner, he said this about public hearings. We've had investigations which have commenced in public. And as a result of that information, other people have come forward and we've been able to go into other areas which have raised significant issues of corruption. The very fact of public hearings brought people out, brought out additional evidence. And he then went on to say, it being public hearings, also shows transparency and accountability for the agency and justifies the case that ultimately is made for change. Now, we had that evidence from the New South Wales corruption body. We had similar evidence from the Victorian corruption body that actually said the lack of public hearings in Victoria eroded trust in their anti-corruption body. We had evidence from the Queensland anti-corruption body that public hearings were a really important part. And yet, in face of that evidence, we had amendments put in that placed this threshold of exceptional circumstances, basically shut the door to public hearings. And you ask yourself, why did that happen? And for me, that was the first time I heard a term that I'd never heard at a state level. And it's a term that has no constitutional basis, it's a term that has no legislative basis, but when Richard spoke about culture, it's a term that I think we should all become really acutely aware of. And that's a term that both Labor and the Coalition repeatedly use. And they say, well, no one in this room understands why they're doing this. Nobody in the crossbench understands why they're doing this. None of those academics or people in the media understand why they have to put all these secrecy provisions in and shut down the flow of information, because only they are parties of government. And this constant phrase of parties of government, it's parties of government that understand why we need layers of secrecy. It's parties of government that understand why we need to shield the Commonwealth from excessive transparency. And it's parties of government that time after time is the phrase used to starve the FOI system of funding. It's the phrase used to justify secrecy in NACC. It's the phrase used to put in place new secrecy provisions and ensure that any existing secrecy provision, even if it's sunsetted, the sun never sets on it. Parties of government is actually code for a two-party conspiracy to protect executive government from the courts, from the Parliament, and from any oversight body that they produce. Because what is very clear, if you follow the decisions and the behaviour of both this government, the former government, the one before that, and the one after that, is we have two political parties in this country, 2.5, if you count the Coalition. We have two political parties in this country whose primary job in the Parliament is to protect executive government and to treat elections as the moment where the trophy of executive government is handed from one of those parties to the other party. They want the trophy to be as shiny as possible. You're not allowed to dent it when you're in government and you have a majority in both houses. And the promise is, when they're in government, when they move from opposition to government, they'll also get handed the trophy, shiny as ever, with no dents, and none of this pesky interference from the Parliament, none of this pesky interference from an anti-corruption body, and we promise to clog up the FOI just like you did. It's actually an incredibly dangerous, Commonwealth-only political disease. Parties of government is code for secrecy, for self-interest, and for protecting the executive. So many of you in this room pointed out the danger of not having transparency in our primary anti-corruption body. Many of you in this room put submissions in and said, actually, a NACC needs to be not just an anti-corruption body, it needs to be an integrity body. And to be an integrity body, it needs to do what the New South Wales ICAC does, and not just put people in jail for actual corruption, but also shine a light on how and why and who. And in fact, that integrity role is absolutely as important, in some ways more important, than the narrow task of corruption fighting. Because we actually want a government that has layers of integrity where we're not constantly putting people in jail for corruption. That's actually a much better outcome from a national anti-corruption body than one that's putting people repeatedly in jail because integrity doesn't exist in the system. And you said, we said, others said, that actually having the NACC operate in secrecy fights against that integrity goal. And now we've seen it. And now we've actually seen it. Because for the many in the public, the first challenge for NACC was what it would do on robo-debt. A notorious, scandalous instance of maladministration, which was so awful and reached into so many ordinary Australians' lives that people lost their lives as a result of the scandal that is robo-debt. The least powerful in the country were the ones who were the victims of robo-debt. And it was delivered by some of the most powerful in the country. And you know, I commenced this contribution by saying we have a system that protects the most powerful, but exposes and and fails to protect those with the least power in society. And robo-debt is Exhibit A in that. The most powerful made decisions that directly harmed and knowingly harmed the least powerful amongst us. And we had a Royal Commission. No one was recommended for criminal prosecutions out of the Royal Commission. People were deeply aggrieved with that and deeply unhappy with it. And they saw that power differential and they said, fix this. And it went to NACC and people said, yes, this is why we have the NACC. This is why we have the NACC. Because the Royal Commission didn't sort it out. We've got integrity problems, we've got corruption problems. What are you going to do? And what did they do? They looked at it and they saw nothing to see. Nothing that troubled the terms of reference, nothing that troubled the jurisdiction of the NACC. And people said, how could this be? Because you know what? Every aspect of that inquiry happened in secret. There was no public hearings, there were no submissions. Every aspect of that robo-debt inquiry by NACC happened in secret. And now we find out, because of an FOI that was directed to NACC, not because of any public disclosure by NACC, now we find out that yes, the NACC Commissioner declared a conflict of interest because the key architect of robo-debt was a colleague and indeed served in the military alongside the NACC Commissioner and had declared a conflict of interest. But we've discovered through the FOI that the conflict of interest was declared, but for reasons that I find unfathomable, the Commissioner decided that he would continue to participate in the discussions about the matter, continue to participate in the management decisions about how robo-debt should be progressed by the NACC, but just step out at the point of the actual decision being made. And we found that out through an FOI. And it all happened in secret. And transparency was forced upon the NACC by an engaged citizen who asked the right questions. And thankfully, and again, I want to thank many people in this room, in the course of the debate into the NACC legislation, we managed to basically cut and paste the inspector provisions from the New South Wales ICAC, which create a much more powerful inspector with greater powers to reach in and force documents out of the NACC, a broader jurisdiction. We created a much more powerful inspector in amendments that we moved, which were opposed by the government in the Senate and only reluctantly accepted by them when it got downstairs because they realised how embarrassing it would be. But we have an empowered inspector in the NACC, and that inspector is currently undertaking the first detailed, lengthy inquiry for the inspector and looking closely at the decision by the Chief Commissioner about the conflict of interest and the decision-making by NACC. But who would have thought that in October 2024, after the election we had, after the promise of transparency, after the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Commission, that the most interesting corruption investigation on foot at a Commonwealth level would be the inspector's investigation of the NACC's decisions on conflict of interest? Who would have thought we would be in that state so soon after that election? I think it's extraordinary. And if you want some more topical concerns, NACC also inherited an investigation into a company called Paladin that got a notorious contract for the management of offshore detention on Manus Island, a contract that went through little, if any, rigour, would be the politest description that I could use in the awarding of the contract. It blew out to a $500 million contract, a $500 million contract. Elements of Home Affairs, current and former, were then current and then former staff were involved in it. It went to NACC, and NACC, of course, reviewed it and found nothing to see. Nothing to see, just a week ago. And if any of you opened the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age today, you would have seen that now the AFP have commenced a fresh investigation into Paladin at a whole bunch of matters that were outside the terms of reference of the NACC investigation, but which would trouble all of us if we looked at it. And I ask you, if the NACC had had a public hearing into Paladin and done what Commissioner Hatzistakos of the New South Wales ICAC had said, and open up to a public hearing and commence a public hearing into Paladin, maybe, just maybe, the people with information, the people who knew, the people who thought that there was a safe place to go to disclose their concerns may have gone to the NACC, and we would have had a NACC investigating what we wanted to investigate, and trust would have been reinforced. But that's not to be. And again, we see this erosion in trust, an erosion in trust in institutions from a very predictable source. So I was intending to speak about AUKUS, but Richard stole all my thunder on AUKUS. How did we decide to spend $368 billion without any oversight? But I'll leave you with just two little snippets from Defence. Right now, there is a contract to build things called Hunter-class frigates. And people haven't heard of Hunter-class frigates as much as they've heard of nuclear submarines, but I'd ask you to guess how much we're spending on what was originally 9, now 6 Hunter-class frigates. They're like a fairly medium-sized war vessel. They're being built down in Adelaide. How much are we spending on Hunter-class frigates? Frigates that many people say are undergunned and unsuitable for our purposes, built under a contract and a procurement process that my office has referred to NACC, and we're still awaiting a decision from NACC. How much are we spending on those Hunter-class frigates? I can't tell you. Although we've asked repeatedly in budget estimates and Senate estimates, we think it's $45 billion because it was $45 billion for 9. We think it's $45 billion for 6, but it might be more than $45 billion for 6. And I don't know about you, but $45 billion seems a lot of money for a project we don't know about. For war vessels that went through a procurement process that was roundly criticised by the Audit Office. How could we not know if it's $45 or $55 billion? Absent the AUKUS frigates projects, that's the single largest procurement contract ever by the Commonwealth, and we don't know how much it is. And for a moment of comical relief, in the last sitting week of Parliament, we had a fight. Myself and Senator Lambie had a fight with the government about the release of a secret report into the oversight of the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Forces, a kind of secret military justice process that happens. And we were having a fight on the floor of Parliament. It went over a couple of days. Jackie's been doing it for a couple of months. We were having a fight to release a report that we knew had been given to the government last year. And we wanted the report released, and there were motions in the Senate to force its release, and the government kept saying, oh no, we can't do this, secrecy, the walls of the Defence Force, Russell's foundations would be shaken if we released the report. And while that was happening, I was quietly Googling away in the Senate, hunting through the exhibit lists in the Royal Commission into Defence suicides, and bang, upturned the report. Literally the debate's happening on the floor of Parliament, and bang, there it is. I look at the thing. I look across at Jackie. I look at the, I go and see I trot to the back of the chamber and show it to one of my staff members. Mr. Brennan, I said, Mr. Brennan, this looks like the report. And he says, that looks like the report. And they're saying it's too secret and we can't see it. It was literally happening in real time. The addiction to secrecy is so extraordinary, so absolutely ingrained, that they were fighting to keep secret a report that had been published, admittedly on an obscure part of the Royal Commission's website. And it happened in real time, just a week ago. We had a press conference the next morning where we had printed multiple copies of this. We, of course, downloaded it, sent it off, put it on a hard file, printed it, gathered around in the next 15 minutes after I found it, and we handed them out like confetti to anybody who wanted them. Because as it turned out, there was a lot of important stuff in there. The walls of Russell are retained. So thanks so much for, I hope, pointing out the stupidity, the damage that secrecy does. Thanks for pushing through the guff and seeing this for what it is, which is a dangerous addiction to secrecy. And thanks as well for staying the course for people like Richard Boyle and David McBride. Because just last week on Friday, I went and saw David again, and he's in jail. he wears prison greens, and he's in jail for a minimum 2.5 and potentially 5 years. He's in jail because he told the truth. He told the truth about war crimes. And Richard Boyle is facing going to jail for telling the truth about obscene misuse of tax office powers. But when I went and saw David, he wanted to let you all know that when you turned up en masse at his court hearing and you cheered him in and you cheered him out, he took enormous strength from that. He took courage from that, and it helps him in his fight. So from David to you, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for continuing to shine the torch. Thank you for believing in transparency. And let's get to a point where we don't just have secrecy for the powerful. We don't strip the privacy off the many, because that needs to be the other way around. And let's make that happen together. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.